Economic policies through the growth of multinational companies have also meant increased wealth for some in developing countries, such as India. And there are a lot of young urban professionals now globe-trotting, moving around from occupation to occupation throughout first world countries. This is one of the advantages of globalization. Yet on the other hand, left behind in India, there are still 6 million people living in dire poverty without any clean water or even a flush toilet. So the trickle-down economics theory in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations has not really moved quickly enough, and this brings about a lot of dissent in modern society. Following on from the 2008 financial crisis, the imposed austerity measures in Europe saw countries such as Greece needing to be bailed out by European nations, which only further increased and fueled the anger, leading to anti-European feelings among those feeling left behind because they felt we were bailing out countries. This has also fueled a surge of right-wing extreme parties, some even with neo-Nazi tendencies, who particularly blame the rise of Islamic refugees from Syria or their local Muslims for much of their own personal financial setback or loss of their own identity and culture. Terrorist attacks from ISIS around Europe have also added to the status quo, and there's a lot of pressure on politicians to change policy on immigration. To date in Europe, most elections fortunately have not resulted in any right-wing extreme politicians having taken the lead, although they have gained seats in the European Parliament and in individual nations. However, it does remain a fact that divided societies are on the rise, and even in the US, the rift between left and right politics is evident, with the recent riotous events in Charlottesville in Virginia illustrating this well. Economic and foreign policies that disadvantage middle and lower classes results in both sides of the political spectrum pointing fingers at each other. The left blames the right for being bigots, racist and xenophobic, while the right blames the left for putting its head in the sand when it comes to mass immigration of the Middle East or the increase of Muslims in free Western democratic societies. This blame and negative publicity on Islam further fuels terrorist attacks, in my opinion. Anyway, this means that extreme right-wing voters in the United Kingdom, under UKIP's Nigel Farage, chose against solidarity in Europe, which delivered the Brexit, showing us that populism can win. And in the USA, dissenters applauded the non-conventional style of Donald Trump and chose him to be president over the much more experienced politician Hillary Clinton. All these changes in the political landscape show that there's a deep democratic cultural revolution bubbling under Western society's surface at the moment, and the problems are complex, to say the least. Back in 1981, the musician Prince sang in the song Sexuality, "We live in a world overrun by tourists." And today it's truer than ever, because globalization's advantage is that it has also allowed much of the middle class entry into the world of travel, where we can enlighten ourselves and grow our global cultural awareness by traveling to different places and meeting people from different cultures. Flights take off around the globe virtually every minute of the day, and the world is on our doorstep. We visit far-off places, remote places of the globe which were once inaccessible except by ship. But because globalization has not accelerated positive change, social change quickly enough for everyone, even though statistics show progress in decreasing poverty levels in poorer nations, for example, in the 1970s, 11% of the world's poor were in Africa and 76% in Asia. But by 1988, Africa hosted 66% of the poor, and Asia's share had declined to 15%. This is taken from a book called In Defense of Globalization, written by Bhagwati in 2004. Therefore, the anti-globalist argument that globalization has only increased poverty in poorer nations or widened worldwide inequality is not completely plausible. One of the advantages of globalization is that there are better standards and regulations in helping to reduce child labor in sweat factories, and also providing microfinance in third world countries, empowering women, for example, in India to better jobs or entrepreneurship. But in first world countries, locals don't feel this, and those in lower skilled jobs tend to blame job loss on foreigners who enter their job market, driving down salaries and the vacancy amount. They claim that globalization has no human face and that it's only this monster gobbling up cheap labour markets. The best definition I found of globalization is from Bhagwati's book, and it is the following. Economic globalization constitutes integration of national economies into the international economy through trade, direct foreign investment, short-term capital flows, international flows of workers and humanity generally, and flows of technology. Those against the anti-globalist sentiment those against the globalization as a whole believe that company owners and shareholders only focus on profit and employ cheaper foreigners to fill their own pockets. In Europe and Britain, it's often the less educated population who fear independence among multiple nations, such as the European Union, and they believe that their country would be better off without the European Parliament. However, I believe this is misguided thinking, as in contemporary times, the rising power of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, known as the BRICS, will see a different balance of power in trade and economics in the future or over the next 100 years. Globalization is also often seen as the extension of capitalism throughout the world, bringing rising resentment and fear of the United States as a militant and economic giant. Yet we do tend to forget that globalization already began a few hundred years ago when the Dutch East Indies Company began colonization through trade, and this was rigorously followed by the British, the French, the Spanish, and Portuguese. In those times, capital flowed profusely, financing the building of railways in Africa and the extraction of minerals worldwide, and this was driven by transportation, technological process, and communications. There are, however, some truths to the anti-sentiment of globalization. And it is true because even in the book, The Defense of Globalization, Bhagwati wrote, "Free trade and free capital flows in haste, without monitoring and regulatory mechanisms and banking reforms, can put nation-states at serious risk of massive panic and outflow of short-term capital flows, driving economies into a tailspin." Now, had politicians and their policies heeded this in advance, they might have been better protected from the 2008 financial collapse. But the global financial system is far-reaching and complex, with everybody dependent on it and competing with each other on it. Still, globalization does bring advancements in social causes that we all value, such as gender equality and poverty reduction, except that its positive effects are felt more in developing countries than the first world economies. Politics is the framework from where modern globalization has been able to expand, and it has enabled economies to grow. It has decreased illiteracy levels and pulled some people up into meaningful employment. For developed country populations, though, many have felt a decreasing empathy as the move from local community extends further into geographical region or continent, where things far from home are harder to understand or to control. What is currently missing in communication to many citizens is reason and analysis from politicians as to why globalization is not working for everybody or why it's not working fast enough. Anti-globalists argue that the Western model is not environmentally sustainable and then the West is in slow decline. A lot of this is angry sentiment, and a lot also comes from general inequality, financial and economic inequality. To balance this status quo, world leaders will need to tackle the downsides of globalization, slow growth, and handle controversial issues such as climate change and immigration, and hopefully not in the way that Donald Trump would like to do it. People with ideas to reduce negative globalization effects are not always politicians. The book Utopia for Realists by a Dutch author, R. Bregman, radically advocates open country borders and a universal income for everyone, rich or poor, and this is really gaining momentum particularly in the last 10 years around the world, where we fear that if AI puts a lot of people out of jobs, people will just need a universal income. Another intellectual is the French economist Thomas Piketty, and he wrote a book in 2014 called Capital in the 21st Century. He proposes converging inequality by introducing a very small tax on capital of high net worth individuals who have often inherited money or park it on offshore tax havens, totally avoiding paying tax at all, and also taxing multinationals more, because they have managed to expedite their wealth for shareholders through aggressive tax avoidance. And this has also gained a lot of momentum, particularly on social media, but also politically through the last 5 years. You'll be aware of the story of Starbucks and Apple's getting their tax rates down to 1 or 2%. Through their corporate complex massive structures and all their profit shiftings, they are taking huge advantage of globalization, which ordinary citizens actually can't. They use all the loopholes and can pay for expensive tax attorneys to work out complicated structures, setting up private limited companies all over the globe which actually don't employ people or have any actual operations, but it's just to use the tax holes in outdated tax laws and treaties. So these offshore tax havens enable the parking of capital of billions, and it's all hidden from governments, which lowers, of course, governments' revenue. It's only when the middle and the lower classes don't struggle anymore, as they did through the crisis years, that the anger, I think, will cease, because dissent is an understandable reaction and almost predictable to forecast. That they'll blame the system when they have losses, and they'll blame it on uncaring politicians or immigrants for the declining financial status. All of this makes us, I believe, less authentic, because we're just pointing fingers at everybody and there's so much anger. And so I hope with these podcasts to just share some information with you all, that we can have a look at the bigger picture together. Next week I'll be zoning in on inequality and having a deeper look at Thomas Piketty's book Capital in the 21st Century. So thanks so much for tuning in and for listening. Hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, have a great evening or day wherever you are.